Morning. As always, I do a lot of reading, and my favorite genre is science fiction. And the one I've been most recently reading is a story about mankind moving on to find an alternative Earth. And the ship that was going to be used to transfer these people could travel at speeds approaching the speed of light. And even at this incredible speed, it would still take hundreds of years to arrive at the planet that they had selected. So cryonics, temporarily freezing people, keeping them in status until such time that they could be thawed out. So essentially, they would sleep until their arrival. But the ship needed human assistance, and a certain amount were kept unfrozen to maintain the ship. And many studies had been done to find out the optimum size of a group that could function together with the degree of familiarity necessary. And if you think about it, or hundreds of years, these beings not only would pass away, but they needed to propagate to continue this optimal size, this optimal number. So it meant potential pairings and the birth and support of offspring. So there'd be 2 or 3 generations that would survive with the spaceship as their home and their only reality. And they were talking about, I was interested when they talked about cognitive limits. Cognitive limits. It means that the terminus of our thinking ability, our ability to keep track of people within our community, to relate. And I'm going to read a little bit from my trusty iPad. So when I went to research this limitation, because in my novel they suggested 150 people as the optimal group, and I went to research this to see if it's based on any science, if this was science fact instead of science fiction. And they talked about 150 to 250 numbers of people as the cognitive limit, with one with whom one can maintain stable social relationships. Relationships in which an individual knows who each person is and how each person relates to every other person. The number was first proposed in the 1990s by British anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who found a correlation between primate brain size and average social group size. By using average human brain size and extrapolating from the results of primates, he proposed that humans can comfortably maintain only 150 stable relationships. Dunbar explained it informally as the number of people you would not feel embarrassed about joining uninvited for a drink if you happened to bump into them bumped into them in a bar. Proponents assert that numbers larger than this generally require more restrictive rules, laws, enforced norms to maintain a stable, cohesive group. It has been proposed that this number lies between 100 and 250, which a common value use of 150. Okay. So, two things caught my attention here. Maintaining viable relationships and so-called cognitive limits, the limits of our brain. And I looked at my own social circle, and it certainly didn't come near to approaching that number of 150. And part of that is that I'm transplanted here. I'm away from my home of Hawaii and making a new home in Taiwan. A 21-year process, I might add. But it's quite a stretch for me to include 150 people in a social group. I've instructed on a university level for many years, and I have students, thousands of students, but very few of them have resulted in adult relationships. Teacher or mentor and students, hierarchical relationship. And I'm sure within the construct of 150 people, certainly on the spaceship, there was hierarchical relationships. At least people had different jobs. And it was interesting as I read, there didn't seem to be that much interaction. The people tended to group together with the people that were doing a job similar to theirs. So I wonder, first of all, about the number. But most of all, I took umbrage with the idea of cognitive limits. There's only so much that your brain is capable of absorbing, storing, and filing. And my personal experience with my cognitive process is that as I've expanded, as I've incorporated, as I've recognized the wholeness, the unity that we all are part of, I really see no boundaries. I don't accept, I haven't experienced limitations, cognitive in particular. We live in an infinite world, not a finite world. The only limits that I'm familiar with is the limits of understanding the vast unknown. In this arena, I recognize and accept the necessity, the reality of the intrinsic unknowable, that is beyond our grasp in this physical vessel. But the pursuit of more and more understanding, the conversion of unknowable to knowable. So it's not a categorical limitation. The dream lives on, and the dream is this expansion. So even in the unknowable, the great unknowable, the opportunity for expansion, grasping, incorporating. I find our minds are incredibly elastic, and barriers, limits are something that I like to explore. Push the boundaries, push the limits. When you do reach a limit, is there a wall separating and say, this is it? What lies beyond that wall? What's to say that we cannot push that wall further and further away? All the time. Remarking or noticing that we are indeed expanding our levels of understanding, our grasp, the processing of the unknowable into the embrace of knowable. So it's an interesting idea, this Dunbar's number, 150 through 250. And I will keep it in mind if I ever have the opportunity to be part of a building of a community. It's worth remembering. But what I'm really here to talk about is my unwillingness to accept any limitations, let alone cognitive limitations. As I've shared many times, cognition, my mind's role in my journey is not only significant, but I would elevate it to paramount, the most important tool I have in my continued expansion. And the discipline of this cognitive abilities, this expanding, constantly expanding cognitive abilities. The discipline is twofold. First and foremost is to recognize where the monkey mind begins and ends with its incessant chatter, its nature of connecting apparently disparate events, and we call it my wandering mind. So first, to recognize, try to tame it, or at least learn to ignore it. It's just noise, and it can be relegated to a white noise instead of constant source of annoyance, a constant waste of energy to shut it down. What about tempering it? What about it reducing it to murmuring? And it's not a giant leap from murmuring to white noise. White noise that will mask outside interference. Help to drown it out. Give you a neutral playing ground for the other uses of the mind. So the recognition, the work, expending as little energy and time on the monkey mind. And the second part is learning to utilize the greater mind more and more effectively. And this includes expansion. I believe that our Dunbar number of people that we can intimately and successfully interact with in a social hierarchy without the necessity for onerous rules and laws that only limit. If we are to accept laws, let's accept laws that expand, not contract. So I believe that, there's that word, I know, this is a better word than believe. I know that we are capable of including more and more people into our social circle at all levels as we learn to seek commonality. And there's no more obvious commonality than we're each part and parcel of the greater whole. So this acceptance of others, this recognition that we're in this together, then the limitations begin to dissolve. When you truly learn that each and every one is your brother or your sister, they're part of your spiritual community. And this great commonality, this realization of the commonality, will go far in breaking down any self-imposed limits. And I do believe that our limitations are self-inflicted. Now you might argue that this is not always necessarily true. We're limited to walking on the earth. We're limited to the surface. But with the aid of technology, we've managed to go to the bottom of seas. We've sent individuals to the moon. We're flying, something that you would categorically say that humans can't do. A limitation is flying. But with our minds, we built machines that are flying each and every day. As I speak to you, millions of people are in the air, flying. So, limitations by nature seem to be self-imposed. If we think on it, if we do, if we act, we'll see that these limitations were not as permanent as they seemed. Human ingenuity, human will has laid to rest many of the previously held limitations. And I've been mostly talking about our progression as a group, pushing at previously perceived limitations, expanding. But I want to go back, as I always do, to a personal level. Our responsibilities in this whole process begins and ends within each of us. We have to personally deconstruct, disappear any boundaries, any limitations that we have placed upon ourselves, tearing down the walls, or simply moving them progressively as you continue your expansion. So when I say begins and ends with us, I mean that the focus, all that we think is without the nature, the construct of the world, turns out to be Maya, simply illusion. Reality, our ability to know reality, lies within. And within, everything simply is. So when I say begin and ends, there is no beginning, and there's truly no end. But it's the diversion of focus. We're trained from birth with the ego whispering or even yelling in our ears. Look out, watch out, fear, fear, fear. This has been our guidance until we recognize the falsity, the tenuous nature of anything the ego creates. Our sense of self, upon close examination, experiential examination, will quickly dissolve, turn to dust, so to speak. And to find the real, we have to turn our focus. As I mentioned before, it's a process of learning not based on outside in, becomes inside out. And when I mention begins and ends here, I simply mean that until you come within, until you explore, you start to understand within, only then can you look without. Again, breathing in and breathing out. So the process literally doesn't end here, and literally doesn't begin here, because the nature of reality is that it always has been so, it is so, and it always will be so. The limitations are all on our side, artificially constructed scrutiny, examination, reflection, meditation will assist you in the beginnings of an understanding, in the beginnings of remembering that which you've always known. The unchanging. The only thing that isn't subject to change is reality itself, its wholeness, its manifestation and expression through each and every one of us. We're united in all that is real. When, and it is a matter of when, because each of us will begin this process of looking inward to ultimately understand all that is within and to expand that to all that is without. Each of us will begin this journey in our appropriate time. Thus, there is never a need to push. There's never a need to hurry. All good things are worth waiting for. So what we do as we're on our own journey, as we're focused within, we take the time and make the effort simply to smile at all those around us. The idea of elimination in any realm, much less our social, psychological, personal realms. We begin to see through compassion, love, through bhakti yoga, through seva, selfless service, we begin to see the unity. Limitations become arbitrary. How, after all, can you limit infinity? And that's what we are. Not finite beings. Although we exist in a finite period of time in this beautiful body that we're gifted with, the infinite is ours.